Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome. It's so good to see all of you this evening. I'm Teresa Jenkins. I am chair of the Public Programs Committee of your League of Women Voters of Greater Tucson. Thank you for spending a part of your evening with us this evening. Our program is going to be focused on immigration. And before we begin, our president, Betsy Boja, would like to say a few words. Hi, Betsy.
Hi, Teresa. Thank you. Just to level set and remind everybody what the League is and does. We are an all volunteer, nonpartisan political organization encouraging informed and active participation in government. We neither support nor oppose political parties or candidates at any level of government. However, we do advocate for public policy issues such as voting rights, education, environmental sustainability, housing and transportation, gun safety, and criminal justice and community safety. The League of Women Voters of Greater Tucson strives to be a welcoming space, inviting all people, regardless of gender, gender identity, ability, ethnicity, or race, to join us as we commit to building a stronger, more inclusive democracy. So thank you all for joining us.
And thank you, Betsy. Thank you for being here this evening and for your leadership. Folks, this program is being recorded and it will be available on our website in the next few days. And as I said earlier, our program tonight focuses on immigration. And the League of Women Voters immigration position includes a path to citizenship and humane border policies. The League advocates for fair, efficient legal immigration systems, opposes the separation of families, and defends the rights of immigrants. And the League often partners with other groups to hold federal immigration enforcement accountable, and that includes ICE and DHS. So you can find more information about the League's immigration actions on the League of Women Voters of the United States website. The website is very easy, lwv.org. It's lwv.org. And there you can find information that includes the statement that the League developed in response to the federal immigration enforcement and escalation of federal military activity in Minnesota, and its letter to Congress opposing additional funding for ICE and Border Patrol. So we are witnessing the incredible power of everyday people to reject assaults on our communities, our Constitution, and our democracy. To continue exercising our people power, we have got to understand what's happening and what rights we hold. So I'm now going to turn our program over to one of our committee members, Marge Huey. She's going to introduce tonight's program and our speaker.
Thank you, Teresa and Betsy. Today's speaker, Juan Rocha, is eminently qualified to speak about U.S. immigration law and how it's being implemented. He came to the U.S. from Mexico as a child and achieved U.S. citizenship. He was a public defender for many years and currently practices criminal and immigration law in Phoenix and teaches immigration law at ASU. He will be speaking to us on the Trump administration's criminalization of the U.S. immigration system. To set the stage for this discussion, I would like to provide a 2-minute high-level overview of the U.S. immigration process as outlined in our laws. First, how do you come into the U.S. legally? Basically, there are temporary entry routes, including being a tourist or short-term business or study needs. There's a permanent entry process with visas and green cards. Categories include certain immediate relatives, employment-based priority workers, certain special immigrants, such as certain foreign employees of the U.S. government. And then there's a separate category of humanitarian and special programs, which includes refugees and asylum seekers. who have experienced or fear prosecution based on race, religion, nationality, or membership in a particular group. And there's a final group called victims of crime category, which covers victims of certain crimes or human trafficking who assist law enforcement. The legal difference between a refugee and asylum seeker is primarily where they are when they apply for legal status. Refugees apply from outside the U.S. and are vetted and approved before they enter. Asylum seekers apply at the port of entry or inside the U.S. and are asking government protection when they're asking for government protection to avoid deportation. There are legal caps on the number of refugees allowed into the U.S. There are no legal limits on the number of asylum seekers. Foreigners at the southern border primarily seek entry to claim asylum under Section 208 of the Immigration and Nationalization Act, the INA. This provision allows individuals physically present in the U.S. or at a port of entry to apply for protection regardless of their immigration status. Once in the United States, what legal rights do people have? Historically, courts have found that undocumented immigrants have certain due process rights, most notably the right to notice and hearing before an immigration judge before deportation. There is an exception for those detained within 100 miles of the border and here less than 2 years. The right to remain silent, protection against unreasonable search and seizure, including not entering a home without a judicial warrant, and the right to hire an attorney are additional rights. And then what power do ICE and the CBT have to detain and deport someone? If a person is in the U.S. illegally, there are certain statutes that facilitate deportation if the individual has a criminal conviction, are a security risk, or have visa violations. Then separate provisions within the INA allow mandatory detention, which does not allow for bond hearing opportunities if the person has specific criminal histories or are deemed a security risk. So all these rules are being turned upside down and twisted inside out. And our speaker, Juan Rocha, will discuss how the current administration is using the color of law to round up, detain, and deport individuals, and what that has meant for people impacted and for the institutional integrity of our immigration system. And I'll start out by asking Juan a question. When we were preparing for this presentation, you said that you had a client whose experience with immigration system personified our current problems. Will you please start by telling us that client's story and why it is emblematic of the systematic problems with our immigration laws?
Thank you, Marge. So yes, many of us think that a lot of the things that we see today are maybe as a result of the Trump administration or the current administration's policy when it comes to immigration enforcement. But the rules have been set for a long time. And so at least my evaluation is that the current administration isn't doing a lot of things that are new. They are stepping, encroaching violations for certain, but the rules have been set. And one person that I think sort of encompasses or personifies as a good example of all this is a client who I'll use his first name, Frankie. So I met Frankie in 2014, and he was appointed to me to represent him in a criminal case. Many people aren't aware that it is a crime, a felony, to re-enter the United States after deportation. It carries up to 2 years in federal prison. And if you've been removed for having committed a felony offense, it goes up to 10 or 20 years in prison simply for trespassing or coming across the US-Mexico border without authorization or inspection. So that's how I met Frankie. He was charged with a federal crime called re-entry of removed alien. And in talking to him, he kept telling me, hey, I'm a US citizen. I'm a US citizen. And I said, well, what do you base that on? And he says, well, my family is Native American. My family is Native American. And his mother brought me a birth certificate issued by the state of Arizona. And so I thought to myself, the moment I saw the caption, wow, we won our case. This man is a US citizen. When I looked at it in a closer inspection, in the title or the area where it says, where was he born? It said San Luis, Mexico. And that was the first time that I had ever encountered that, where a state in the United States can issue a birth certificate for a person not born in this country. And that flummoxed me, because under federal law, the federal government cannot issue you a birth certificate. That is only for the 50 states in the union. So then to have the states issue a birth certificate for someone born overseas just seems sort of bizarre to me. So the closer I looked at it, it turned out was adopted. And so before 2014, Frankie had committed or had pled guilty to burglary, and he was sentenced to federal or state prison. In state prison, he was placed in deportation proceedings. So he's actually in custody in the Department of Corrections in Arizona. And he's transferred to Tucson, another correctional institution there, to have an immigration hearing. And that's allowed after President Clinton signed the IRA in 1997. So he's there. He doesn't have an attorney. He's obviously detained. And although someone does have a right to an attorney, they don't have a right to a court-appointed attorney in immigration proceedings. And that's a huge, huge advantage if you do have one. So he's there. He's telling the judge, hey, I'm a US citizen or I'm Native American. The judge doesn't seem to really guide him through the process. And there's a number of things that he tells Frankie. So in the end, Frankie just gives up because he's not able to present the evidence. And he says, you know what, just deport me, just deport me. And the judge says, certainly, we'll do that. There's like no push, nothing. The court grants his wish. So he's deported. Now, how did the government show that Frankie was a U.S. not a U.S. citizen? It didn't. It only showed documents that his adopted father in 1994 had filed. There was nothing else. Frankie never admitted to having been born in Mexico. He never made that admission. Okay. And I get asked by my students, how does the government prove someone's born in another country? And I tell them basically by what they tell them. So if I get detained, I tell ICE I was born in a foreign country. That's enough to then deport me to that country. They don't have to have any corroborating evidence. That's enough for me to be removed. So it's what happened more or less to him. He gets removed, and now he's an aggravated felon, so he can never come back to the US. There's no way of coming back. So he attempts to come back. He's not able to. On the second try, he comes back, and that's when he becomes my client. I do some research, and he's adopted, as I mentioned. So in going through all of that, I find that his mother, he has a biological mother, and gave birth to him in 1974, excuse me. And so in doing that, I kept looking and searching, and I saw a document that was filed in court because they had a stamp on it. And then I asked the U.S. Attorney's Office, hey, where did this document come from? And so the rules for evidence are so different from immigration. Criminal defendants have more rights than people who are in immigration proceedings. And so the rules of disclosure are much more favorable to defendants. So I was able to get these sort of documents. Now, the challenge was that in the 1970s, Arizona had closed adoptions. So the adoptee was never able to determine who his parents were, because in those days, Arizona wanted to protect the parent who gave the child up for adoption. And so the U.S. Attorney's Office had to go through all these hurdles to unseal the record. Once they did that, and I reviewed it, and you look through the documents, the story, before I tell you the spoiler alert, the story was that Frankie's mother had become pregnant out of wedlock. And so through the help of some Christian organization, she then went to Mexico to give birth to Frankie in a convent of nuns in Mexico, in San Luis, Mexico, just across the border from Yuma. And then a day or two later, Frankie's mother comes back without Frankie, and then Frankie somehow finds his way back to America. And so my first thought was like, that story seems just odd. Are you telling me that Catholic nuns are smuggling children through the US-Mexico border without Border Patrol knowing this? Like, that's just insane. That I know that doesn't happen. So once I got the documents from family court that were sealed in 1975, it turned out that all of that was a lie. Frankie's mother had never been to actual Mexico. Uh, the home study that was done to go through the adoption, the home study person said that Frankie was born in Phoenix, Arizona. And nobody had seen those documents. Frankie had attempted to get them during the proceeding in immigration court with the judge, but he wasn't able to do it because he was detained. And those are very difficult to do. And Arizona had closed adoptions. It was only through the help of the U.S. Attorney's Office I was able to get that. So in doing that, I found the full name of his biological mother, and I had someone who was a law clerk here who had a real estate license, and she happened to look up to see if she had any property. We found her, and it turned out that she lived within a 1 mile radius of where Frankie lived. And so she was still alive. I went to talk to her, and when I approached her about the story about the nuns, she said that was all a lie. That never happened. She said that she told me that she had been sexually assaulted as an 18-year-old, and she gave up the baby for adoption. And she used the help of a Christian organization in the Valley in those days to help her shield. And she didn't want to go to the county hospital or any place because she was afraid. And this is like 3 months before Roe v. Wade was decided. So even if she wanted to have an abortion, she wasn't able to do it in Arizona because they were illegal. So she had all of these factors. And so she says, I've never been there. And then she produced her birth certificate. She was born in El Paso, Texas. So I have her El Paso County birth certificate. And then she signed a declaration, an affidavit saying that she had never been to Mexico in her life and that she gave birth to Frankie in Phoenix, Arizona. So I'm like, yeah, great, we won. Well, sort of. The case was dismissed. Frankie gets transferred to immigration court where he spends another 18 months in immigration court. Okay. Because the district court judge doesn't have jurisdiction to give him citizenship. He can dismiss the case, but cannot do anything beyond that. So Frankie spends 18 months in immigration court. So finally, ICE or DHS says, okay, you've proved enough that your guy here could be a US citizen. So they release him. But then they say, we can't give him citizenship because he says he was born in Phoenix, Arizona, not in another country. So USCIS can give you a certificate of citizenship if you're born in a foreign country like Japan. And then I was like, okay, well, what about the State Department? The State Department says, no, we can't do that either, because we can give you a certificate of citizenship if you are born in another country to parents who are U.S. citizens, but you live in that country. So if my dad's U.S. citizen, I'm born in Mexico, and I never make it to the U.S., I can still apply for a certificate of citizenship. It's called a CRB through my dad, and then I derive citizenship through him. The U.S. State Department says we can't do that because your guy is alleging that he was born in Phoenix, Arizona. So then we go to the state of vital records here in Arizona, and they say, we can't do anything because we've issued you a birth certificate already. And by law, we can't amend it without a judge's order. Oh, and by the way, we have no idea how that issue with San Luis, Mexico, was on that birth certificate because we don't have any corroborating evidence. And that just dumbfounded me. Like, what? How can you issue something without any evidence that this person was born in a foreign country? So we finally get to civil court. We file our petition, and then the judge denied the petition to amend the birth certificate. And the judge says, well, look, I've never had this situation before, and I really don't know what the standard of proof is, so I'm just going to make it up. And I'm not exaggerating. That's what he says. I'm just going to make it up. And to me, that really bothered me because he can't do that. Judges can't just make up the law. But that's what he did, and he denied Frankie's request to amend it to reflect Phoenix, Arizona. And so right now, Frankie is a man without a country. He doesn't have a social security number. He doesn't have a birth certificate, so he can't get a job. And Mexico has no recorded birth of him, so Mexico doesn't recognize him as one of its own. And this is where he is. He's sort of in this legal purgatory. And when President Trump comes into office, when we hear about people being detained who are U.S. citizens, while Frankie's example might be a slight exaggeration, just a slight one, the question is, how do you prove you're a U.S. citizen when when only the U.S. government can grant citizenship, but proof of that citizenship is provided by the states? Right? That's the chasm of our federalism system here. And so that's where Frankie fell through the cracks because the federal government says, we can't help you. You got to go to the states. The states are like, well, we can't help you either because the laws don't allow us. And that's where he is today. And when you see people like in Minnesota, this happened in Maryland as well, who are approached by ICE and say, show us your papers, it's perfectly reasonable for the person to say, well, how am I supposed to do that? We don't carry around our birth certificates. We may not travel, so we don't need a passport. So then how do we prove that? How do you prove that? And that's the thing that the Trump administration has been able to exploit. Show us that you are from here, or otherwise we'll just remove you. And that's where I think the chasm is. And that's why they've been able to exploit that hole and detain people who are US citizens who go through like hell and back to try to get some proof that they're born here to be able to be released from custody. And I feel like that is just one point in a larger scale here of what's going on with the immigration enforcement. Is sort of let's arrest people first, and then we'll determine all the other stuff later. And part of the reason is just because of what I just said, that there is a big gap in the U.S. The U.S. government is the one can grant citizenship. States can't do that. States cannot grant. But the way you do that is through proof of states' birth certificates, and that's a problem because this happened even during after the civil war amendments, where after blacks were freed and they were born here. Well, how do you prove you're born here when the whole time the system was set up to show that you are not even human, right? And that's the same situation you have currently with people like Frankie, where it's like, well, how do I prove this? And so I feel like that is a good segue because he touches on how state law, family law, criminal law, immigration law, the lack to an attorney, the sort of indifference of judges, due process. How can you have an immigration court hearing that you could be deported while you're serving a state prison sentence? Like, how's that done? And also the lack of competent attorneys who can be able to advise people. If you plead guilty to this crime, you could be deported from the United States. All of that are very esoteric, very arcane concepts that are hard to explain. And that's why this area is merging together. And if you don't know something about both, you're gonna be in a situation where your client could end up like Frankie.
Is Frankie still in limbo?
He is. We're working on an appeal right now to get the court to overturn the decision.
One of the things that seems to be happening a lot under this current administration is that immigrants who are in the country are losing their legal or protected status, then being detained and deported. How is that possible?
Well, I think that the legal status part is ambiguous. It's not what we think. These are not fixed concepts, fixed knowable concepts. They're in flux. There is a person who is from Honduras that I have as a client. He was able to get a U visa through his stepdaughter, who was a victim of a violent crime. And so USCIS gave him something called a bona fide determination. So they're saying, hey, look, you passed all the tests. The only thing is we just don't have enough visas because Congress, when they passed the Violence Against Women Act in 2001, only allocated 10,000 U visas every year. And right now there's like a 5 to 6 year backlog with that. And so they say, well, you're done, but you won't get one for about 2 more years. So he's technically not U visa, but he has some lawful status. So he was arrested at Ranch Market here in Chandler. And when he was apprehended, he did show them that. And the ICE officer said that is no good here. And he took him into custody. Until 2 weeks ago, he was released from immigration custody through a habeas corpus petition. And so I asked the same question. Wait, I thought that this was a way to protect him. He had a deferred action. And the judge says no, because he can apply for a U visa in Mexico or in Honduras. So in other words, we can deport him and he has a way of coming back because the U visa doesn't expire if he's removed, but he can do that in his home country. And that's what they're doing. Where under the Biden administration, people who had that kind of visa or that bona fide determination were untouchable. ICE was not allowed to remove any of those individuals. But here with President Trump, it doesn't matter if you have that. They can remove you. That includes the Violence Against Women Act, which is I-360, a T visa, which is victims of sexual trafficking, uh, the U visa, asylum. So even if you have some type of lawful status, like I'm waiting for my case to be called, they can detain you and remove you from the United States, even if you have those pending applications, because at least from the eyes of the government, your application's not eliminated or somehow deleted. You can still do that, but you got to do that from the comfort of your own home, whether it's Mexico, Honduras, El Salvador, or any other country in the world. So that term legal status is very ambiguous, and I can only say that if you want to be clear as to who that would be, it would be obviously U.S. citizens and people who are legal permanent residents. Everyone else is in flux.
In that regard, can you talk about like the status given to Cubans and to the temporary protective status and what that means and doesn't mean now?
Well, that's also a loaded question, because every country has a different type of protection, TPS protection. So they could eliminate it for Haitians, they could eliminate it for Somalians or something, and another group could still be protected, like Salvadorians. So what it is it's a type of, they call it deferred action. So you've heard of deferred action for childhood arrivals, DACA, right? That's what it is. They're saying, we know you're here and we know we could remove you, but we're not going to do that. We're going to defer your removal for some other day. In the meantime, we're going to recognize that you're here. We're going to give you some sort of status. Here's a work authorization, and you're going to be able to get a social security. And so that's where sort of this, if I can lump them all together, that's sort of where this group falls into. So if they were to revoke that status, they then don't have the protection anymore that they have, deferred action. Now the deferred action is immediate action. Now we can remove you, okay? But they would still have arguably a due process claim to be able to apply for their asylum. They could still do that, because ICE has that discretion to not remove them and then have their case of that day in court. That can always happen. The same thing for people who have DACA. The ICE could strip them, but they still have a due process right to be able to see an immigration judge, for example. So it depends on what country, it depends on what type of deferred action that tells you what sort of remedies you have if that were to be revoked. And so even if they do strip people of that, that doesn't necessarily mean, like, people happen from Venezuela. A lot of them had TPS and that was taken, but many of them are still applying for asylum. And now, given that there's a new president in Venezuela and there's still political instability, to me, the irony is that they have a better claim to asylum than they did before, because the country is not stable. And the law says that you should not remove a person, a refugee, to a country that has instability, right? So that's what I mean, that even if they strip that TPS, they can still apply for asylum and go through the due process remedies that they have to appeal and file petitions for review with the Court of Appeals.
So can you please explain how the Trump administration, with the support of one court, has expanded the use of mandatory detention where there's no opportunity for bond hearing and release?
Well, I just talked about this in class yesterday. So uh, they've done it in many ways, but let's take one I think that many of us might be familiar with, the Lake and Riley Act. Okay. So that was his first major piece of legislation he passed February of 2025. So what that does is it creates a category of mandatory detention for people here who are inadmissible. So it happened because a person from Venezuela was released after he committed or was charged with shoplifting, and then he committed that horrific act against Miss Riley. So before this, there was INA Section 236C that has a category of people who are subject to mandatory detention that includes, like, what you typically think of, drug traffickers, homicide, that sort of crime of violent type of offense. What the Lake and Riley did was add to that, and but they weren't even violent offenses. And it was even worse because at least under the 236C regime, you needed a conviction. Here, you don't need that. So simply by you being arrested for shoplifting, even if you're never charged, if you're never convicted, you're subject to mandatory detention. There's no way out of that. That passed through Congress. That wasn't a unilateral action through the Trump administration. That went to the president, went to the Senate, went to the House. Uh, Senator Gallego voted for it, that piece of legislation. And there are people now who are inadmissible. That means they entered without inspection, who just could commit an act of shoplifting. Maybe it was just an accident, as a mistake. It won't matter because once they're arrested, that's all it does to trigger mandatory detention. And that includes theft, larceny, shoplifting, arrest by assault on an officer. These crimes were not included in the list. But as I said, even worse, you don't need a conviction for it. You don't need even a charge. So they could arrest you and then release you the next day. And then the day after that, ICE can pick you up, put you in Florence, and you would never see the day of light. And that's one. The other part is the Hurtado case. So the DOJ is not an independent agency. So we think of judges as being kind of independent. That's not the case with immigration. Immigration judges are really administrative officers, administrative hearing officers. So they don't really have the power of subpoena that we think of. They can't decide constitutional issues. So they're more hearing officers. And so they're really at the behest of whatever the attorney general tells them. The attorney general could unilaterally make a decision and just say, this is what we're going to do. And then litigants would have to obviously challenge the law. Well, they did that with initially with the making sure that everyone who entered without inspection was subject to mandatory detention, and that was the Hurtado case. So it came out, I think, September of last year, but the Trump administration by July of 2025 was already denying bonds to anyone who entered without inspection, and then Hurtado just cemented that in September. So they made it legal in September through a decision by the Board of Immigration Appeals. And right now, there's class action lawsuits throughout the country challenging that decision. And even though there have been some great challenges in the Central District in California, a judge has found that the Hurtado case is vacated. Judges, even as of today, this very day, are ignoring the decision and saying they don't have jurisdiction to grant the bond, right? And of course, when you're confined in prison, you're going to make different decisions because immigration detention is really prison. You're going to make different decisions than if you're actually outside working with your family than when you're inside a prison cell, because that's what it is, than you would if you were not in those situations. So more and more people are now turning to the federal courts for what they call habeas corpus petitions. And right now, the federal courts are drowning in habeas petitions. Texas has a problem. They don't have enough district judges, and they're just swelling with habeas petitions because it's the only way out of there if you're inadmissible. And that's an important category because if you're admissible, you enter with a visa, for example, you would be eligible for a bond because you were inspected and admitted to the US. So those people, even if they commit the shoplifting offense, are not subject to mandatory detention. They're considered deportable, not inadmissible. So that's like little distinctions that can drastically change the trajectory of a case.
So are the inadmissibles the illegal immigrants then? I'm confused about your terminology.
Yeah.
Can you explain that more?
Yes. So inadmissible typically is someone who enters the country without inspection. The specific code in the immigration book is 212. That's what they call it, INA section 212. People who entered with inspection are considered admitted and inspected. They're considered deportable, and they fall under a different section of the INA, which is 237. Now, for the most part, they are very similar, but there are material differences between the two. And bond or detention is one area currently where that difference makes a huge difference. So, with respect to the term illegal, I think that's also, like I said before, the terms that are used often don't really capture what's going on actually, because someone can enter the country with a visa and overstay their visa, and people will still refer to them as illegals. Well, but he entered the country with the visa, he overstayed his visa. So, but they're not illegals. What they're doing is they're accruing what they call unlawful presence. That's what they call it. Okay. Someone who enters without inspection still accrues unlawful presence. It's just the difference is that they're not admitted and inspected, and the unlawful presence time begins to accrue the moment they enter the country. And that makes a big difference as to what types of relief you're available. A lot of people, women especially, ask me, my child is 21, can I have her apply to become a US citizen, for me to become a permanent resident? And I said, well, how did you enter the country? With inspection or without inspection? Without inspection, then you can't do it. You can't. There's no way. But if you enter with inspection, if your child is a citizen, then yes, you can do it. So when I think it was during the first Trump administration, you heard the word or the phrase anchor babies, right? And I told my class, let me disabuse you of all of that. There's no such thing. There is no such thing. It doesn't exist. I know it's a political term. Legally, there doesn't exist because even if you enter with inspection, you have to wait 21 years until the child is even eligible to apply. That's number one. And if you're even eligible for what they call cancellation of removal, that's 10 years you'd have to, do that. And it's not as easy as people think. So I said, there really is no such thing. They can remove you even if your child is born here. In fact, I've been in situations where the ICE officer says they can take their child with them. And the child can always come back if they want, but it's not my concern. It's not my fault that they bought a house here. They should have thought about that before they came. That's the sort of response I would get from ICE.
I'm going to ask people to raise their hand when they have questions, and we'll pick those up. I have a couple of more questions, and I'd really like to get the audience involved in asking questions as well. And I want to turn to some of the activities of ICE, and that by asking, there's been one federal district court ruling that ICE must identify and be unmasked pursuant to the 14th Amendment protection against unreasonable search and seizure. Do you think that decision will be upheld by appellate courts and the Supreme Court?
Well, I think it'll be upheld by the appellate courts. I'm not so sure about the Supreme Court. Although lately, the Pedraza case, I think that came out in September, where it was authored by Justice Kavanaugh. He gave ICE pretty broad powers to do their detention work or apprehension work. But then later he's walking them back because he sees what actually happened from that. So maybe through their decisions, they might not do that. But I think the Supreme Court will likely not, will overrule the lower court's decision. That's the way I see it, just from my own experience. Now, they be unmasked? Yes, of course, because how are you able to argue? Part of our, and this is important here. Are we dealing with criminal law or are we dealing with immigration law? Because in criminal law, it's a fundamental principle that you have a right to confront the witness, see that person face, have them tell you to your face, you did this, right? The exceptions are government informants, but even then don't have a complete immunity, because if you can show that without their testimony, your guy would never have been charged, you have a right to bring that person to court, okay? So for me, how is that any different out in the field? You should be able to see who's the person who's a law enforcement officer apprehending you. If you have that right in court, it should exist out in public as well. And I'm hoping that, I know the appellate courts will uphold that, but I'm hoping that the justices at the Supreme Court will look at, and those issues are raised, that you have a right, a constitutional right, to confront witnesses to their face. That's why we have public trials, right? Immigration, not so much. That's why the difference makes where you are in the universe makes a difference as to what due process applies. And that's important to know. Now, if you're really savvy, like me, you're able to really use the criminal courts to use them to help you on the immigration side, right? You know what you're looking for, and you're pushing Rule 16 stuff. Hey, yeah, let me see that. Let me see the A file. And that way you can use it so you're not beholden to ICE on the immigration side. So there are ways to sort of use that information. Now, I know that somebody might watch this video and says, "Hey, you can't use that stuff in other cases and stuff." To some extent, there's a protective order. Certainly, can't do it, right? But for the most part, it's germane to the case. You have that. You can certainly figure out because all of these things are mixed. They're stuck together. To unstuck the immigration side is going to help you on the criminal side and vice versa. So that's how I think that the question of like, well, should these people be wearing masks? No. And I also think that even though it's not in your question here, I always want to make this clear. Most people that come to this country, come from places where people with masks come out and abduct people. Mexico is a place like that, right? They wear masks and you don't know who they are, right? You don't know. And you have every right to defend yourself. So in here, if the guys are wearing a mask, how do you really know they're ICE agents? You don't. How do you know they're trying to abduct you? You have a right to defend yourself. That's the part where you're creating a cocktail for disaster here, more tragedy, where you're not able to be transparent about that. And again, that's why I believe that they should be able to show their face to see who it is, because if they're required to do that in court, at least criminal court, then they should be required to do that when they arrest you.
Dee, would you unmute yourself and ask your question, please?
If I heard you right, they are not supposed to deport people back to countries that are unstable.
Yeah.
And yet we know they started deporting people to Sudan, which is hysterically unstable. But it also looks like they're ignoring judges' orders when they say you can't do that. Is there anything we can do to protect these people?
So yeah, the general rule is they can't do that. They can't. I mean, the Sudan, yeah, you're right, is unstable. If I remember, a week or two ago, there was a decision that says that the Trump administration can't do that anymore to third party countries. I think they call it. They can't do that anymore. But you're also right that they're also disobeying the decisions. Now that became very clear on the. I think how do you say it? Abreu, the gentleman who was that. So I told this to a different reporter. What the Trump administration or President Trump is doing, he's really showing us the whole system here is based on an honor system. And I told him about how Andrew Jackson, when he was removing Native Americans from certain land, they were suing him and they were winning at the Supreme Court. And Chief Justice Marshall, ruled in one of those cases for Native Americans. Andrew Jackson got word that he lost, and then he turned to one of his aides and says, Chief Justice Marshall has made his decision. Now let me see him enforce it. Right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's like right there. Like he knew it. He could just exploit that. What is he going to do? They don't command armies. They're not going to do. And it's why you have like just in Minnesota alone, you have 64 orders to show cause. That's just in Minnesota. That's in Minneapolis alone. Like, can you imagine everywhere else? They're just not following the rules. But what are judges going to do? And I also feel I'm not planning to run for office, so I don't care. I feel judges are timid. They don't do more. It's like, no, bring them out there. Sanction them. Do something. You're good. Well, we'll let it go. No, do something. Like, come on, have gumption. I don't see that coming from them. They're timid. And I saw the gentleman on 60 Minutes who was on the judiciary for 40 years. He's like, yeah, I've never seen this sort of threat. Yeah, but then do something. Like, you guys have more power than I ever will have. You guys can sanction the lawyers because their bar license is at stake. Maybe you can't take it out on the Department of Justice, but individually they have a bar license, right? Do something to that. And there are some attorneys who are just resigning and not want to be part of that, complicit to that system. So I feel like, what can we do? Well, I don't want to say not much. I think we should continue to litigate this for sure. I think that I remember reading this, and maybe this might help assuage my fears, maybe not yours, but the great Mexican writer Octavio Paz asked the question: why did Martin Luther King have such success? His civil rights movement have such success in America, where Nelson Mandela didn't have that in South Africa. And the answer he came up with is that South Africa apartheid didn't have the democratic principles and values and traditions that they had in America. And it's what made Dr. King's ability to create change easier than Nelson Mandela. And I think about that when I get asked this question, because I think like that's why they won't succeed, because we have traditions and values in our country that we don't stand for those things. And we're going to, I think collectively we're marching, we're voting. And I think as a collectively, we have to use that political arm. So I think that's what gives me hope, is that those traditions and values that we, all of us uphold, will allow us to get past this sort of difficult time.
May I ask one more question?
Sure, Dee.
I was looking at this because of the SAVE Act, but both my husband and I names do not match our birth certificates. My husband changed his name 66 years ago, and he remembers having a thin piece of onion paper from the court that verified his name change. But the chance of us finding a 66-year-old piece of onion paper for a 91-year-old man, and for me, I married and took his name. And so I'm wondering if we are having those problems, and we're fortunate we do have passports, but most of the nation doesn't. Where do we go from here? How does an immigrant prove it when American citizens can't prove their birth certificate and who they are?
Oh, so going back to traditions, we really believe in our federal system, right? Of states and the federal government, the separation of powers. Uh, I think they would take a big fundamental change for Congress to say we are going to be the ones, and I just don't see this happening. But it did have some movement during, I think it was maybe George Bush's second term in office, where they tried to make a national ID for people. They have that, for example, in Mexico. They call it a credencial, I think. It's an ID that's a national ID. So it doesn't give you, it's not a passport, so you can't leave the country and come back. But there was talk of that, but it fizzled out. And I don't see it happening, only because we don't like big government. We don't want those sorts of things. So I think until we change that value, that this is a utility that we should have to have uniformity, I think we're going to continue to have this sort of disconnect between how do we prove you're here, and I think sometimes immigrants who are not U.S. citizens have an easier time because they have to, by law, carry their permanent residency cards or other types of identification with them at all times.
There's a question that came through the chat, and that was, how did the South Africans get entry into the United States?
So that's a good question. So the president does have a lot of power, because the Supreme Court, it has nothing to do with President Bush, has, Congress has plenary power to amend, pass immigration laws. And of course, the president has the power to enforce them. So the president could arguably, which he did in this case, say, we're going to admit people who are, I guess, subject to, you can make it up. I mean, that's what attorneys, well, let me rephrase that. You can come up with an argument that South Afrikaners are being subjected to abuse or cruelty. You could do that. And it's not unheard of, because they did that for, President Biden did that for Ukrainians. They were allowed to come in. So there are certain powers that the president has to unilaterally allow certain people to come into the country based on circumstances that might, again, create political instability, war. So that does happen. It's not permanent, it's temporal, right? But it does happen. And so that's the answer to that question. So if there's an argument that they're subject to some sort of abuse, war, famine, what have you, then the president could say this particular group is allowed entry into the U.S., and then he through his administration would set up procedures to make it happen. But President Biden did that with Ukrainians when the Russians invaded Ukraine, I think in 2022, excuse me.
Teresa, you want to unmute yourself and ask your question, please?
Yeah, thank you. Do you think that the ICE agents who have been acting lawlessly, um, ignoring the law, will ever be held accountable for their lawlessness?
I would hope. I would hope so. I would hope so. Um, but this is a good question, and I won't go into any of the weeds here. But police have a huge immunity here. I think it was a civilian that did this. That's different. But police have a large amount of immunity from prosecution, and so I think you could arguably have a question that was raised that he was acting within the capacity of a government official, that he was trying to defend himself, and then find some sort of way to say he was immune from prosecution. Uh, I think that could happen. So they would, I wouldn't say evade accountability. I don't want to sound too partisan there, but I think that's where they would fall to escape accountability. I think you need an administration who's obviously willing to at least to be independent and look at this from sort of a neutral lens. And here we don't have that because everything's been shielded. I mean, I've never seen to this day those two people who have been murdered in Minnesota. I don't even know who the people are that murdered them. Like, I've never seen a picture of them. I've never seen an indictment. When Minnesota attempted to step in to take over the prosecution, the president said, "No, this is our province. We'll take care of it from here." And they can be shielded from prosecution until another administration comes. But just because you have another person, whether Republican or Democrat, comes in, that person can still, I think, argue immunity, if assuming they were an officer, given that peace officer status. So it's hard to say because we don't know anything about the person that committed these sorts of acts or other people who are doing other acts. But I think that these steps of showing transparency will be a deterrent because, when you see someone's face and then you blast it out on social media, I think that's a little deterrence there. And I think people don't want that kind of attention. And that's why they're fighting hard, because they don't want that, because people are not inclined. We could be keyboard warriors because nobody knows who we are behind the keyboard. But show me your face, and that's a different story. I think that's the deterrence here. So it's hard to say for me. I would hope so, but I do see a situation where they would argue immunity through different federal laws.
Question from Tong Longnet on the chat feature. The complicity and inconsistency of various players overseeing immigration laws is mind-blowing, monumental. Is there a path to solving the inconsistencies in a meaningful way for current and future individuals seeking citizenship? Who has the power to convene the parties to achieve this, or is it impossible?
Well, I don't think it's impossible. I think they were attempting to do that in 2012. Some of you may remember Marco Rubio and Lindsey Graham were actually co-sponsors on a bill in 2012 for immigration reform. It would have granted those students who are now DACA a path to green card status and then citizenship. But John Boehner, who was the Speaker of the House at the time, didn't bring it up to a vote, and it just died once that Congress session ended. So when that bill, that's what those reforms were going to do, was to sort of streamline and make it easier, less bureaucratic. But it didn't pass. And what's happened over time, it's become more convoluted. I started private practice in 2013, and the system wasn't perfect, but you had an understanding of predictability of how it worked. Today, that's not even the case. Before I jumped on the call, I looked at the AILA listserv, the American Immigration Lawyers Association listserv here in Arizona, and one attorney was said, I don't know what to do. They keep changing the rules here, and as an attorney, that sort of undermines your credibility, because any client, real estate, probate, transactional, whatever, they come to you, and when they ask you a question, your whole job is to give them a sense of what comes if they do X, if they do Y, right? It's predictability. Here you can't say, well, I don't know, maybe it could happen, maybe. That doesn't give your client confidence. And so I don't see right now any political will on either side really to make it happen. President Biden could have done something more there in his first term, and he did minimal stuff that only the president can do, but only at the margins, because it's really Congress. You hear that President Trump is given like the gold card LPR if you have like $1 million. And I told my wife, I said, that's impossible. He doesn't have the power to do that. Only Congress can do that. So, so that's the part where I feel like you don't have that will that could have more substantive changes to allow people to come into the country with inspection, work, and maybe return to their countries. That was the guest worker program President Bush was going to sign in 2001, but be sent to Fox. 3 weeks later, 9/11 happened. They were supposed to meet in Toledo, Ohio in 2001 to sign a guest worker program agreement. And it never happened and it never materialized. And 9/11 happened. And instead, we got ICE. That's when DHS was birthed, right? It didn't exist before then. And so, see, we got more bureaucracy as a reaction to what happened. And so I don't see that. I don't see anything like that happening in the foreseeable future. I think things are going to get, I hate to say worse, but they're not going to get any better. It's dysfunctional. Um, and I certainly don't have an answer, a panacea to any of this because I'm so stuck in there. Sometimes I don't even see my way out sometimes. Uh, I don't know if I answered your question and giving you a sense of a hope. I think that the 2012 Gang of Eight, that included Senator McCain, is an example of a possibility. But because I think that people say this all the time, we're so divided as a country, and immigration is such a hot topic that I just find it hard to see that finding a more efficient, more humane system. I just don't see that happening for the foreseeable future.
What are ways we can help protect our neighbors who might be in peril?
I think just on a practical level, obviously having a contact information, right? Like who to contact. I think that's important because I think sometimes my clients watch too many movies and they think I'm entitled to a phone call. And I'm like, where'd you get that? Like there's nothing in law that says you're entitled to a phone call. It just doesn't exist. And that might be true maybe in criminal court because you do see a judge at some point, but not in immigration court. There's times where people don't know where people are for 4 or 5 days. So I think that's important, finding that. Number two, I think that if you have a legal representative, filing what's called the G28 or having one on file, that way they can find the nearest ICE office, contact the ICE officer, hand that to them, and their legal representative would be able to get more information. And then my experience is that generally, not all the time, ICE officers are willing to give you information about the client. It may not be everything you would want, but they give you at least basic information of where they are, if they're doing well, if they need medication. I think overall, not in every case. So I think having a G28 on hand is also a good thing. And I think the last thing is if you know your neighbor, I think you should, if you see I think there's a common misconception, I think, that ICE will just go to your house and then just blow the door open and come in. ICE rarely ever does that. The easiest thing to do is just wait for you to come outside your house and then just arrest you on the street because they can approach you in a public space. So for them, it's just easier. If they do it, it's because they want the optics of intimidation. That's what they do it for. It's for the television. But overall, in my, I don't know, 20 years experience, ICE seldom ever does that. What they do is just wait for the person to come out and then they arrest the person and take them away. So maybe looking for, is that car out of place? Do you know this person? I saw this person come by your house. I think anyone you might think of as maybe not someone who's a known person. I mean, if you live next to your neighbor, I know my neighbors pretty well and I know their families. And so I think if somebody came by that maybe wasn't there, I might be like, hey, who is that? So just communicating. I think sometimes we don't talk to our neighbors. And I think lastly, is for if you know someone who may not have immigration status, they should go and seek legal counsel. You'd be surprised how many people are sitting on a lottery ticket. They could be victims of crimes. They could have eligible for VAWA that they don't know, and they just sit on that. And then the only reason they learn about it is because they've been arrested. But all that time that they lost, that they could have already been on a path, I think is just unfortunate, because then maybe they would have already been permanent residents. It happens all the time, all the time. So if you know someone who might not have status, they should go seek legal counsel from an attorney about maybe what sort of possibilities they have. In Frankie's case, nobody helped him, and only through the U.S. Attorney's Office and getting those records were we able to see that he was a U.S. citizen. And that's why he's still here. The government won't deport him because they believe he's a U.S. citizen. They just can't give him a birth certificate. Oh,
It's 6:30. There are two additional questions. Are you able to take those two questions?
yeah.
Okay. Was there ever any recourse for those Mexican American citizens who were caught in the outrageous Mexican repatriation
Uh,
back in the late 30s under the Hoover administration? That was not too long ago. Were any of these American citizens allowed back in the United States?
so I don't know I don't know the answer to one individual person. What I do know is that that's why yes, I mean that person could I could have been born here in 1932 in Yuma, Arizona, and then at that time people will tell you there was nothing there. You could cross freely, and it was open borders, as they say today, right? You would want to so you could, but not in the way that you had with the Bracero program. So there were people there who were not, for example, given wages that were then compensated for lost wages during the Bracero program, who were then deported during what they called Operation Wetback. Here, during the Hoover administration, it wasn't labor, right? It was more ethnicity, race, and they were removed. Do you have a monetary, if you're still around, way to get money? No. But your descendants, maybe US citizens that were born in, I'm sorry, maybe were born in Mexico who are US citizens, they could actually they could derive US citizenship from you. It is possible to do that. It happens. It's not common, but it does happen that you have people from that era who were born in America and might have lived in Mexico, but they meet the physical presence requirements, and they could actually end up transmitting citizenship to their offspring. So that would be my answer to the question about Coolidge, where you don't have a financial way to compensate them, but maybe it's the best way if they do have offspring who are born there, that could be a way for them to get citizenship. And if they themselves are precluded, they should go seek counsel, because they could show, if they were around, they could take census records from 1930 to see if you're around, that you were counted in the census. That would prove that you were here. So there are ways you could prove you were born in America. It takes a lot of investigative work, but it's not impossible.
And then the last question is, what about civil court? If they
Mm.
deport someone without their medication and they die, can the family sue the agents?
So that's a little bit above my weight class. So, but I think the general answer is yes. The general answer. I know there is a federal case that does allow someone to bring a cause of action, even if they're in a foreign country. If the acts happen in America. So there is something that could be done, but I wouldn't want to speak to more than that, since that's a little bit above my pay grade on that. But I think generally there should be a way. And I know that there's that case that does allow. It was a Supreme Court case that allows somebody in a foreign country to sue. In fact, while not exactly on point, I don't know if you recall in Tucson, I think it was 5 years ago, was it, or maybe El Paso? One of the border patrol agents shot a young man who they thought was trying to come in, and the family in Mexico sued the officer, and they were successful. So, if that's a shooting, I don't see why. If you could show causation, I arguably you would be able to get some compensation for that.
Last thing is that Juan is going to make available through the league website a PowerPoint that talks about what ICE can and cannot do. And so that will be posted along with the recording for this session. So on behalf of the league, Juan, I want to thank you so much. This was incredibly informative, fascinating, and so timely. So we appreciate it tremendously. And maybe we'll have you back if you're willing at some point in time in the future.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Yeah, I'd be happy to, and I hope everyone took at least one small thing from this. So thank you.
You're getting a lot of handshakes, so hand clapping. So yes, I'm sure we did. So thank you very much. Take
You
care.
all have a great evening.
Good evening, everybody.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.